William Williams stood at the edge of the small wooden dock, staring across the dark waters of Lake Michigan at what had to be the strangest purchase of his life. Blackwater Island stretched before him, 12 acres of dense forest and rocky shoreline that he'd just bought for the impossible price of $900. The seller had vanished the moment the cash changed hands, leaving no contact information and only a hastily scrawled deed. Falcon, his loyal German shepherd, pressed against his leg with unusual tension, the dog's ears pinned, back and hackles rising as he gazed toward the island. Something was wrong. The locals had scattered when William mentioned the island's name, their faces darkening with what looked like genuine fear. Even the boat captain who'd agreed to ferry him across had demanded double payment and refused to stay longer than necessary to unload their supplies. Please support us by liking the video and subscribing to the channel. William was a veteran who'd served his country with honor before retiring to a quiet life that had become too quiet after losing his wife Martha 2 years ago. The house they'd shared for decades felt hollow now, filled with memories that both comforted and tortured him. Falcon had been his constant companion through the grief, more than just a pet but a true partner who seemed to understand William's pain without judgment. The decision to buy this remote island had been impulsive, born from a desperate need to start over somewhere new, somewhere that didn't echo with Martha's laughter or smell like her favorite lavender perfume. He'd found the listing buried deep in obscure real estate websites, a property that had been on the market for over a decade with a price that kept dropping. At the dock, he encountered Yara Chen, a park ranger stationed at the nearby state facility who'd come to investigate reports of someone moving to the island. Her dark eyes held genuine concern as she warned him about Blackwater Island's reputation. The place had a history that local people didn't like to discuss, she explained, centered around the Hartwell family who'd owned the island 30 years ago before vanishing without explanation. Police investigations had turned up nothing, but the community's collective memory was long and unforgiving. Yara's professional demeanor couldn't quite hide her personal interest in the case. She'd been researching the Hartwell disappearance for years, hoping to finally solve a mystery that had haunted the region since she was a child. Her grandfather had been one of the original investigators, and she'd grown up hearing whispered conversations about evidence that didn't add up, and witnesses who suddenly stopped talking. The official report claimed the family had simply left the island without warning, possibly fleeing financial troubles or family disputes. But Yara had never believed that explanation. Too many things had been left behind. Too many arrangements left unmade. Too many people who claimed the Hartwells had been planning to stay on the island permanently just weeks before their disappearance. Blackwater Island sat in splendid isolation in one of Lake Michigan's deeper sections, surrounded by treacherous currents that had claimed several small boats over the years. The island's heart was dominated by old-growth forest, towering oaks and maples that had stood for centuries, their canopy so thick that even midday sun barely penetrated to the forest floor. Remnants of human habitation dotted the landscape like broken teeth, a collapsed cabin here, a crumbling stone foundation there, all slowly being reclaimed by moss and vine. The island's shoreline was rocky and inhospitable, with only 2 small beaches that could accommodate a boat landing, both protected by natural harbors that suggested they'd been chosen carefully by previous inhabitants. William had noticed a young boy in a bright yellow kayak circling the island's perimeter during his first reconnaissance trip. The kid, maybe 12 years old, had stayed carefully in the shallows, never approaching the shore despite his obvious curiosity. When William waved, the boy had paddled furiously back toward the mainland. Later, he learned this was Oliver, son of one of the local fishermen, and apparently one of the few people brave enough to get even that close to the island. The boy's father, Carter, ran a small fishing operation and knew these waters better than anyone, having worked them for over 3 decades. Local maritime records showed that Carter's family had been fishing these waters for generations, making him one of the most knowledgeable sources about the island's history and the treacherous conditions that surrounded it. The island itself seemed to have its own weather patterns, with fog that rolled in at unexpected times and winds that could shift direction without warning, creating navigation hazards that had caught experienced boaters off guard. Even on calm days, the water around Blackwater Island remained choppy and unpredictable, as if the lake itself was warning people to stay away from this particular piece of land. Carter himself had approached William at the marina with an offer of help that felt more like a warning. The weathered fisherman, his hands permanently stained by years of handling nets and bait, had insisted that William was making a mistake buying the island. His pale blue eyes held an intensity that made William uncomfortable, as Carter described the dangerous currents, the unstable soil, and the way storms could cut off the island for days at a time. There was something almost desperate in Carter's warnings, as if he were trying to save William from a fate that the fisherman understood all too well. Carter had offered to buy the island from William for twice what he'd paid, a generous offer that seemed motivated by more than simple concern for a stranger's safety. The older man's knowledge of the island's hazards was encyclopedic and specific, detailing everything from seasonal flooding patterns to areas where the ground might give way without warning, information that could only have come from extensive personal experience with the island's terrain. But it was Falcon's reaction to the island that truly unsettled William. The German shepherd, normally calm and obedient, had spent their first boat ride across standing rigid at the bow, his intelligent brown eyes fixed on something in the island's interior that William couldn't see. Once ashore, Falcon had immediately begun pulling toward the center of the island, his nose working overtime as he followed scent trails that were invisible to human senses. There were sounds coming from the deep woods at night, rustling that was too deliberate to be wind, too heavy to be small animals. Something was waiting to be discovered in this place, and Falcon seemed to know exactly what it was. The dog's behavior was so unusual that William began to wonder if Falcon had some kind of ancestral memory or instinct that was guiding him toward secrets that human senses couldn't detect. During their first night on the island, Falcon had refused to sleep, instead maintaining a vigilant watch toward the forest interior, occasionally letting out low whines that seemed to communicate recognition rather than fear. William and Falcon began their systematic exploration of the island with the methodical approach that had served William well during his military service. They started with the perimeter, mapping the shoreline and identifying the safest landing spots before moving inward toward the mysterious forest heart. The ruins of the old cabin sat in a small clearing about a quarter-mile from the main beach, its roof collapsed and walls green with decades of moss growth. The structure had obviously been substantial once, built from local stone and timber with the kind of craftsmanship that suggested the builders had intended it to last for generations. But underneath the rotted floorboards, Falcon's persistent digging revealed something remarkable. A hidden basement carved directly into the bedrock, its entrance concealed by carefully fitted planks that had somehow survived while the building above crumbled. Inside the underground chamber, protected from weather and animals by thick stone walls, they found wooden crates filled with personal documents, family photographs, and handwritten letters that painted a picture of the Hartwell family's life on the island during the 1990s. Every document, every photo, every personal item spoke of a family that had simply vanished mid-sentence, as if they'd stepped out for a walk and never returned. The basement felt like a time capsule, preserving not just objects but the sense of interrupted lives, of stories cut short without explanation or closure. Among the most intriguing items were detailed maps of the island, showing locations marked with symbols that seemed to follow some kind of family code, and financial records indicating that the Hartwells possessed wealth far beyond what their known business interests could account for. There were also letters that mentioned growing concerns about outside parties, asking questions about their activities, suggesting that the family's disappearance might not have been as mysterious as it appeared. The documents revealed a family living in increasing isolation and paranoia, with references to security measures and contingency plans that hinted at serious threats to their safety. One letter, written in Eleanor Hartwell's careful handwriting, mentioned her fear that they were getting closer, and that the family might need to use the island's protection sooner than expected. Yara proved to be a wealth of information about the Hartwell family's history on Blackwater Island, sharing details that went far beyond what appeared in official records. During one of her regular check-ins on William's progress, she revealed that her interest in the case was both professional and personal. Her own family had been among the first to notice when the Hartwells stopped making their regular trips to the mainland for supplies and mail. The family patriarch, Robert Hartwell, had been a successful businessman who'd made his fortune in shipping, while his wife Eleanor was known for her charitable work and love of nature. They had 2 sons, David, the elder, who'd been groomed to take over the family business, and Michael, the younger, who'd always been more interested in adventure than commerce. Family tensions had emerged when Michael announced his intention to join the military against his father's wishes, leading to a bitter argument that ended with the young man leaving home and never returning. Eleanor had tried to maintain contact with her estranged son, but Robert had forbidden any communication, believing that Michael would eventually come home on his own terms. When the entire family disappeared in the summer of 1994, there had been no trace of Michael for investigators to follow, leading some to wonder if the missing son might hold answers to the mystery. Yara suspected that someone in the local community knew more than they were telling, but 30 years of silence had made people protective of whatever secrets they held. She also mentioned strange reports from other park rangers and fishermen over the years, unexplained lights on the island at night, the sound of boat engines when no boats were supposed to be there, and most intriguingly, occasional sightings of what appeared to be a large dog roaming the island's shoreline during full moons. The ranger had compiled a detailed file on these sightings, noting patterns that suggested the mysterious dog had been present on the island for far longer than any normal animal lifespan would allow. Yara had also discovered discrepancies in the official investigation records, including witness statements that had been altered or removed entirely, and evidence that key investigators had been pressured to close the case prematurely, despite having several promising leads they wanted to pursue further. Oliver proved to be far more knowledgeable about the island's history than his 12 years should have allowed, possessing the kind of detailed local knowledge that usually took decades to accumulate. The bright, curious boy had been watching Blackwater Island his entire life, and his sharp mind had absorbed every story, rumor, and half-whispered conversation he'd ever overheard. When William finally got a chance to speak with him properly, Oliver revealed that his father Carter had worked for the Hartwell family during their final years on the island, serving as their boat captain and fishing guide whenever they wanted to explore the surrounding waters. Carter had been one of the last people to see the family alive, but he'd always refused to discuss that period of his life, becoming angry and withdrawn whenever Oliver asked questions about it. The boy had defied his father's strict prohibition against approaching the island, making secret kayak trips to explore the shoreline and satisfy his burning curiosity about what had happened to the people who'd once lived there. Oliver had noticed something else unusual. Falcon's behavior around certain parts of the island was almost human-like, as if the dog possessed knowledge or memories that went beyond normal animal instincts. The way Falcon moved through the forest, the confidence with which he navigated the terrain, the specific locations that drew his attention, all suggested a familiarity that shouldn't have been possible for a dog who'd supposedly never been to the island before William bought it. Oliver also shared local legends about the island that his generation had inherited from their parents. Stories about strange howling on windless nights, about boats that approached the island and were never seen again, and about a guardian spirit that protected the island's secrets from those who would exploit them. The boy had even drawn detailed maps of the island's coastline, marking spots where he'd seen unusual activity or heard sounds that couldn't be explained by normal wildlife. His observations were remarkably accurate and detailed, showing the kind of patient surveillance that suggested Oliver had been studying the island with scientific precision despite his young age. He'd also noticed that certain animals seemed to avoid the island entirely, as if they sensed something that humans couldn't detect, while others, particularly birds of prey, seemed drawn to the place in unusual numbers. Carter's offer to help with island exploration had seemed generous at first, but William soon noticed troubling inconsistencies in the fisherman's behavior that suggested his motivations were more complex than simple neighborly concern. The older man possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the island's geography, describing hidden coves and inland features with the precision of someone who'd spent considerable time exploring every corner of the place. He knew which areas were prone to flooding, where the ground was unstable, and which paths through the forest were safest for navigation. This level of detailed knowledge went far beyond what a boat captain would need for his professional duties, suggesting that Carter had spent much more time on Blackwater Island than he'd initially admitted. More concerning were the moments when Carter's helpful facade slipped, revealing flashes of anxiety whenever William discovered something new, or when Falcon led them to locations that clearly made the fishermen uncomfortable. Carter had a particular interest in knowing exactly what William had found in his explorations, asking detailed questions about the contents of the basement and the specific areas where Falcon had shown unusual interest. He also made subtle suggestions about places on the island that should be avoided for safety reasons, though his explanations for these warnings were often vague and unconvincing. The way Carter watched Falcon was especially troubling, his pale eyes following the dog's movements with an intensity that suggested recognition rather than simple curiosity. There were moments when Carter seemed to be studying Falcon as if trying to solve a puzzle or confirm a suspicion that had been troubling him for years. When William mentioned some of Falcon's more unusual behaviors, Carter's reactions were immediate and telling, suggesting that the fisherman knew more about the island's secrets than he was willing to admit. The older man also displayed an intimate knowledge of the Hartwell family's routines and preferences, describing details about their daily life on the island that went beyond what a casual employee would typically know. Carter spoke about the family's fears and concerns in the months before their disappearance, with the kind of specificity that suggested he'd been more involved in their lives than he wanted to acknowledge, and his emotional reactions when discussing certain aspects of their disappearance seemed genuine and deeply personal. The stranger who introduced himself as Harrison changed everything about William's peaceful island exploration, bringing with him an atmosphere of danger and hidden agendas that made William's military instincts flare to life. The man appeared without warning during William's third week on the island, emerging from the forest like he'd been watching and waiting for the right moment to make contact. Harrison was tall and lean, probably in his 40s, with the kind of weathered face that spoke of years spent outdoors and the sharp, restless eyes of someone carrying significant emotional weight. He claimed to be an amateur historian and explorer who'd been researching disappeared families throughout the Great Lakes region, presenting himself as an expert on cases like the Hartwells who'd vanished without explanation. His knowledge of the family's history was impressive and detailed, including information that William hadn't found in any of the documents from the basement, which should have been reassuring but instead felt somehow threatening. Harrison's questions about William's discoveries were too specific and too urgent, focusing particularly on whether William had found any family records, financial documents, or items that might indicate where the Hartwells had hidden their valuables. The man's interest in Falcon was also troubling. He studied the dog with an intensity that made William protective, asking pointed questions about where Falcon had led him and how the animal had known to look in certain locations. Falcon, for his part, maintained a constant state of alertness around Harrison, often positioning himself between the stranger and William, with the protective instincts of a trained guard dog who sensed a genuine threat. There was something predatory in Harrison's manner, a calculating quality that suggested he was constantly evaluating the situation and planning his next move based on information that William wasn't privy to. The stranger's clothes and equipment were expensive and well-maintained, indicating resources that seemed inconsistent with his claimed status as an amateur researcher. and his hands showed calluses and scars that spoke of harder work than historical research typically required. Harrison also displayed an unsettling familiarity with the island's layout, casually referencing landmarks and geographical features that he shouldn't have known about if he'd truly been researching from a distance. His questions about the Hartwell family had an urgency that went beyond academic curiosity, and there were moments when his carefully maintained scholarly demeanor slipped to reveal something much more personal and potentially dangerous underneath. William's investigation of the Hartwell family documents revealed far more than he'd initially expected to find in the hidden basement. Among the yellowed papers and faded photographs, he discovered detailed financial records that painted a picture of a family with significant wealth beyond their shipping business interests. There were bank statements showing large, regular deposits from sources that weren't clearly identified, investment portfolios worth millions in today's money, and most intriguingly, several letters from lawyers discussing the establishment of a trust fund that would preserve the family's assets for future generations of Hartwells who might need them. One particular letter, dated just weeks before the family's disappearance, mentioned concerns about outside parties who had been asking questions about the family's business dealings and suggested that Robert Hartwell was considering temporary relocation until certain legal matters could be resolved. The documents also revealed the existence of a detailed will that left everything to "my missing son Michael," should he ever return to claim his rightful inheritance. But it was a hand-drawn map tucked inside Robert's personal journal that truly captured William's attention, showing locations on the island marked with cryptic symbols and notes written in what appeared to be a simple family code. Cross-referencing this map with the island's actual geography, William realized that several of the marked locations corresponded exactly to places where Falcon had shown unusual interest, suggesting that the dog's instincts were somehow connected to the Hartwell family's secret activities. The financial documents also revealed a pattern of increasingly large cash withdrawals in the months leading up to the disappearance, as if the family had been converting their wealth into portable assets in preparation for a hasty departure. The cave system that Falcon led him to was far more extensive and complex than anything William had imagined could exist on such a small island. The main entrance, hidden behind a curtain of thick ivy and fallen branches, opened into a natural limestone chamber large enough to hold a small house. But this was clearly just the beginning of a network that extended deep into the island's bedrock, with multiple passages branching off in different directions, like the roots of some enormous underground tree. The cave had obviously been used as more than just a natural shelter. There were signs of deliberate modification and improvement, including wooden supports in areas where the ceiling might have been unstable, carved niches in the walls that had once held oil lamps or candles, and most surprisingly, a freshwater spring that bubbled up from the cave floor and disappeared again through cracks in the far wall. Someone had lived here, and recently enough that their presence still lingered in small details that spoke of human habitation. A crude bed made from salvaged materials, empty cans that once held food, scraps of fabric that might have been clothing or blankets, and most disturbing of all, dark stains on the stone walls that looked suspiciously like dried blood. Falcon's behavior in the cave was unlike anything William had seen from the dog before. Instead of the excited exploration that characterized his usual investigations, Falcon moved through the space with careful, almost reverent steps, pausing at specific locations as if remembering events that had occurred there years or even decades ago. The cave system extended much deeper than William felt safe exploring alone, with passages that sloped downward into complete darkness and chambers that echoed with the sound of distant water movement. Most unsettling of all, there were signs that someone had been using the caves recently. Fresh scratch marks on the walls, disturbed sediment on the floor, and the lingering smell of wood smoke that suggested fires had been lit in the deeper chambers within the past few months. Harrison's true nature began to reveal itself through small inconsistencies and moments when his carefully constructed persona slipped to show something darker underneath. During their second meeting, He made casual references to details about the island's layout that he shouldn't have known if he'd truly been researching from a distance, describing specific landmarks and geographical features with the precision of someone who'd spent considerable time exploring the place firsthand. His questions about William's discoveries became increasingly aggressive and specific, focusing particularly on whether William had found any maps, codes, or documents that might lead to hidden valuables. When William mentioned the cave system, Harrison's reaction was immediate and telling. His composure cracked for just a moment, revealing an intensity that spoke of personal investment rather than academic curiosity. The man's interest in Falcon was also becoming more pronounced and concerning. He'd begun asking pointed questions about the dog's behavior, his apparent familiarity with the island, and whether William had noticed anything unusual about Falcon's reactions to specific people or places. There was something predatory in the way Harrison watched both William and Falcon, as if he were calculating distances and planning his next move. Most troubling of all, William had begun to notice that Harrison seemed to know exactly where William had been exploring each day, suggesting that the man was conducting his own surveillance of the island and its new owner. Harrison's equipment was also more sophisticated than what an amateur historian would typically carry, including high-end communication devices, professional-grade camping gear, and what appeared to be night vision equipment hidden among his research materials. When William casually mentioned some of the symbols he'd found on the Hartwell map, Harrison's reaction was immediate and intense, his eyes lighting up with unmistakable recognition before he quickly tried to mask his interest with scholarly enthusiasm. The first direct threat came on a night when the autumn wind was howling across Lake Michigan with unusual ferocity, creating perfect cover for anyone who might want to approach the island, unseen. William had been reviewing the Hartwell documents by lamplight in his temporary shelter when Falcon suddenly went rigid, his ears pricked forward and a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. The dog's warning came just moments before dark figures emerged from the tree line, moving with the coordinated precision of people who'd planned this approach carefully. Harrison led the group, but he was no longer bothering to maintain his facade of friendly curiosity. His face was hard and determined, and the weapon in his hands made his intentions clear. Behind him came two other men that William didn't recognize, both carrying equipment that suggested they'd come prepared for a serious search operation rather than a casual confrontation. Harrison's voice carried clearly across the small clearing as he called out his demands. William was to surrender all the documents and maps he'd found, reveal everything Falcon had shown him, and then leave the island immediately and permanently. There would be no negotiation, no compromise, and no second chances. The alternative, Harrison made clear, was that William's peaceful retirement would end right here on this remote island where his body might never be found. But William's military training kicked in immediately, his mind automatically assessing the tactical situation and identifying possible escape routes. Falcon seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, pressing close to William's side while maintaining the alert silence of a combat-trained dog who knows that survival depends on stealth and timing. The confrontation lasted only moments before William made his decision, grabbing the most important documents and disappearing into the forest with Falcon leading the way along paths that only the dog seemed to know. The chase through Blackwater Island's dense forest was like nothing William had experienced since his military service. A deadly game of cat and mouse played out in terrain that offered both opportunities and dangers for hunted and hunters alike. Falcon proved to be an invaluable guide through the darkness, leading William along paths that were invisible to human eyes, but clearly familiar to the dog's enhanced senses. They moved through sections of forest so thick that Harrison and his men had to use flashlights, creating moving beams of light that served as beacons for William to track their pursuers' positions while remaining hidden himself. Falcon seemed to know exactly where he was going, leading William away from the obvious escape routes toward the more treacherous interior of the island, where the terrain became increasingly difficult to navigate. They passed through stands of ancient trees whose massive trunks provided cover, across streams that would mask their scent trail, and around sinkholes and unstable ground that could trap anyone unfamiliar with the island's hidden dangers. But Harrison and his team were persistent and well-equipped, using night vision equipment and radio communication to coordinate their search pattern in a way that suggested military or law enforcement training. More concerning, they seemed to know the island almost as well as Falcon did, suggesting that this wasn't their first time hunting someone through these woods. The pursuit took on a surreal quality, as William realized that his hunters were following specific routes and checking predetermined locations, as if they were working from their own map of the island's geography. Falcon's guidance became increasingly crucial as they navigated through areas where a single misstep could mean a broken leg, or worse. But the dog's confidence never wavered, leading William through the maze of natural obstacles with the assurance of someone who'd traveled these paths many times before. The marshland on the island's northern edge was a treacherous maze of standing water, soft ground, and vegetation so thick it formed a living wall that could swallow a person without trace. William found himself relying completely on Falcon's instincts as they navigated through this dangerous terrain, trusting the dog to find the narrow strips of solid ground that would support their weight, while avoiding the deceptively calm pools that could be ankle-deep or deep enough to drown in. The air was thick with the smell of decomposing plant matter and stagnant water, and every step seemed to release clouds of insects that added to the misery of their desperate flight. Behind them, they could hear Harrison's team struggling with the same challenges, their frustrated curses and splashing footsteps indicating that they were having considerably more difficulty with the marsh's obstacles. But they were still coming, still following, and William knew that his pursuers' superior numbers and equipment would eventually overcome any temporary advantage the terrain might provide. Falcon led him to a small island of solid ground in the marsh's center, a rise barely large enough for both of them to crouch together while they caught their breath and planned their next move. From this vantage point, William could see the lights of Harrison's team spread out in a search pattern that was methodically covering every possible hiding place in the marsh. The water around their small refuge was deeper than it appeared, and William realized that they were effectively trapped unless Falcon could find another route to safety. The dog's behavior had become increasingly agitated, not with fear, but with what seemed like frustration, as if he were trying to remember something important that would help them escape their current predicament. It was during this desperate pause that William overheard the radio conversation that changed everything about his understanding of the situation on Blackwater Island. Harrison's voice crackled through the static, giving orders to his men with the authority of someone accustomed to command, but his words revealed motivations far more complex than simple greed or treasure hunting. He spoke about cleaning up loose ends from 30 years ago, about making sure the truth stays buried, and most chillingly, about eliminating witnesses in a way that made it clear William and Falcon were far from the first people to be hunted through these woods. The conversation revealed that Harrison knew exactly what had happened to the Hartwell family, and more importantly, that he was willing to kill to prevent that knowledge from reaching the outside world. This wasn't a treasure hunt gone wrong. It was a cover-up that had been maintained through violence and intimidation for 3 decades, with Harrison and his associates serving as enforcers who eliminated anyone who got too close to the truth. William realized that his purchase of the island had inadvertently triggered a crisis for people who thought their secrets were safely buried in the past, and that his discovery of the hidden documents and cave system had made him a direct threat to their continued freedom. Falcon seemed to understand the gravity of their situation, pressing closer to William and maintaining the alert silence of a dog who knows that survival depends on remaining undetected. Somewhere in the darkness, Harrison's team was closing in, and William knew that their temporary refuge in the marsh would soon become a trap from which there might be no escape unless they could find a way to turn the tables on their hunters. The situation escalated dramatically when Harrison's radio crackled with news that made William's blood run cold. One of Harrison's men reported that they had successfully captured Oliver, the 12-year-old boy who had been kayaking near the island when the confrontation began. The child's terrified voice could be heard in the background, calling for his father, as Harrison's associate confirmed that Oliver was now being held at their base camp near the island's southern shore. Harrison's voice carried clearly across the marsh as he issued his ultimatum. William had exactly 1 hour to surrender himself and hand over all the documents he'd found, or Oliver would suffer the consequences of William's stubbornness. The threat was delivered with cold professionalism, but William could hear the underlying desperation that suggested Harrison and his team were running out of time and options. Meanwhile, Carter had arrived on the island in his fishing boat, ostensibly to search for his missing son, but his behavior struck William as oddly controlled for a father whose child had just been kidnapped. Instead of the panic and frantic searching that would be expected, Carter seemed to move with purpose toward specific locations, as if he knew exactly where to look. Yara had also attempted to reach the island after losing radio contact with William, but her boat had developed mysterious engine trouble just as she'd approached the treacherous waters surrounding Blackwater Island. Stranded on a nearby rocky outcrop, she could see the lights moving on the island, but was helpless to intervene or call for backup due to the remote location's poor communication coverage. As the deadline approached, William realized that Harrison's plan was more sophisticated than a simple kidnapping. It was designed to force William into a position where he would have no choice but to comply with their demands or watch an innocent child pay the price for his discovery of 30-year-old secrets. William knew he couldn't abandon Oliver to Harrison's mercies, but he also understood that walking into their trap would likely result in both their deaths once Harrison had what he wanted. Drawing on his military experience, William began to formulate a desperate plan that would require perfect timing and complete trust in Falcon's extraordinary abilities. He started by using the island's treacherous geography to his advantage, leading Harrison's search teams on a circuitous route through the most dangerous areas, while he and Falcon made their way toward the kidnappers' base camp via a path that only Falcon seemed to know. During their careful approach, Falcon exhibited behavior that William had never seen before, leading him to a hidden cache buried beneath an old oak tree near the island's center. Inside a waterproof container, William found weapons that appeared to have belonged to the Hartwell family: hunting rifles, ammunition, and most surprisingly, what looked like military-grade equipment that suggested the Hartwells had been preparing for exactly this kind of confrontation. The discovery reinforced William's growing suspicion that Falcon's knowledge of the island went far beyond what should have been possible for any ordinary dog. As they prepared for their rescue attempt, Falcon's behavior became increasingly focused and purposeful, as if the dog was remembering skills and knowledge that had been dormant for years. William also found a detailed tactical map of the island among the weapons, marked with defensive positions and escape routes that had obviously been planned by someone with military experience. The map confirmed William's suspicion that the Hartwells had been expecting trouble and had prepared accordingly. But it also raised new questions about how Falcon had known where to find these preparations and why the dog seemed so familiar with military tactics and equipment. As they moved toward the confrontation that would determine Oliver's fate, William realized that he was about to discover not only the truth about what had happened to the Hartwell family, but also the secret of Falcon's mysterious connection to this island and its tragic history. The first major revelation came when William and Falcon reached a vantage point overlooking Harrison's camp, and William got his first clear look at the man who had been terrorizing the island. In the bright light of the camp's generator-powered floodlights, Harrison's face was clearly visible, and William was shocked to see features that were unmistakably similar to those in the Hartwell family photographs he'd found in the basement. This wasn't a stranger seeking treasure. This was someone with a direct connection to the missing family, someone who had been living with the knowledge of what had happened on this island for 3 decades. But the biggest shock came when Falcon suddenly went rigid beside him, not with the alertness of a dog sensing danger, but with what appeared to be recognition of something that defied all logical explanation. As William watched in amazement, Falcon began to exhibit physical changes that shouldn't have been possible. His eyes took on an almost luminescent glow quality in the darkness. His movements became more fluid and predatory. And most unsettling of all, his size seemed to increase as his muscles tensed and his coat stood on end. It was then that William realized the incredible truth about his companion. Falcon wasn't entirely dog. The animal's exceptional intelligence, his uncanny knowledge of the island, his remarkable longevity, and his almost supernatural ability to navigate in complete darkness all suddenly made sense. Falcon was a hybrid, part dog and part wolf, created through selective breeding by the Hartwell family, who had needed a guardian capable of protecting their island sanctuary from human threats. The hybrid had been living on Blackwater Island for 30 years, surviving in the wild and maintaining a solitary vigil over the secrets buried in the island's caves and forests. When William had arrived, Falcon's domesticated genetics had recognized him as someone worthy of trust and protection, leading to the bond that had formed between them. But now, faced with a direct threat to someone under his protection, Falcon's wilder nature was emerging, transforming him from a loyal pet into something far more dangerous and capable. The rescue of Oliver became a masterclass in coordinated tactics, as Falcon's hybrid nature allowed him to move through Harrison's perimeter with the stealth of a wild predator while maintaining the intelligence and loyalty of a trained companion. Using skills that seemed to come from genetic memory rather than training, Falcon approached the camp from the downwind side, moving so silently that even the electronic motion detectors Harrison's team had deployed failed to register his presence. William watched in amazement as Falcon systematically disabled the camp's security measures, chewing through sensor cables with precision that suggested he understood exactly how the equipment functioned. The dog's approach to Oliver's location was equally impressive, as he seemed to know instinctively which tent held the captured boy and how to reach it without alerting the guards. Oliver's initial terror at seeing the large, wolf-like creature emerge from the darkness quickly turned to wonder and trust as Falcon gently freed him from his restraints and began leading him away from the camp through routes that avoided all the sentries and patrols. The escape was complicated by Oliver's injuries from his rough treatment by Harrison's men, but Falcon adapted his pace and route to accommodate the boy's limitations, sometimes allowing Oliver to hold on to his thick fur for support as they navigated particularly difficult terrain. The pursuit that followed was intense, but brief, as Harrison's men found themselves at a severe disadvantage, trying to track a hybrid animal through territory he knew better than they ever could. Falcon led Oliver to safety with an efficiency that spoke of years spent planning and preparing for exactly this kind of emergency, bringing the boy to a hidden shelter that had obviously been stocked with supplies and medical equipment by someone who understood the island's strategic requirements. As Oliver recovered from his ordeal, he revealed that his captors had been arguing among themselves about their next move, with some of Harrison's men expressing doubts about their leader's increasingly desperate tactics and the wisdom of involving an innocent child in their cover-up operation. The storm that struck Blackwater Island that night was unlike anything the region had experienced in decades, turning an already dangerous situation into a fight for survival against both human enemies and the raw fury of nature itself. The weather system had approached without warning, bringing with it winds that exceeded hurricane force, rain that fell in horizontal sheets, and lightning that struck the island's highest points with terrifying regularity. The storm's arrival transformed the tactical situation completely, as both Williams' group and Harrison's team found themselves struggling against conditions that made their previous conflict seem insignificant by comparison. Trees that had stood for centuries were uprooted and hurled across the island like matchsticks, while the storm surge from Lake Michigan began to flood the lower elevations and fill the cave systems with rising water. Visibility dropped to mere feet, even with artificial lighting, and the howling wind made communication impossible, except at close range. Harrison's sophisticated equipment became useless in the face of nature's assault, while Falcon's natural instincts and knowledge of the island's safest shelters became the group's most valuable asset for survival. The hybrid animal seemed completely unaffected by the storm's fury, moving through the chaos with confidence while guiding William and Oliver toward high ground and secure shelter. But the storm also brought unexpected advantages for their human enemies, as Harrison and his remaining men were forced to abandon their exposed camp and seek shelter in the same cave system where William had made his earlier discoveries. The converging of all parties in the underground chambers set the stage for a final confrontation that would determine not only who would survive the night, but also whose version of the truth about the Hartwell family's fate would ultimately prevail. As the storm raged overhead, the caves began to flood from both the rising lake water and the torrential rainfall, creating a time limit that added deadly urgency to the conflict brewing in the darkness below ground. William found himself forced into the flooded cave system alongside Harrison and his men, all of them seeking shelter from the devastating storm that was tearing Blackwater Island apart above their heads. The underground chambers that had once seemed spacious and secure now felt like a trap. With water rising steadily from multiple sources, and the sound of the storm creating an ominous backdrop to the tense confrontation that was brewing in the darkness. Harrison's desperate facade finally crumbled completely as he found himself face to face with William in the cramped confines of the main chamber, surrounded by the evidence of the Hartwell family's final days, and with nowhere left to run from the truth he'd been trying to bury for 30 years. It was then that Carter made his unexpected appearance, emerging from one of the deeper passages with an expression of grim determination that immediately changed the dynamics of the confrontation. But instead of the concerned father that William had expected, Carter's behavior was that of someone who knew exactly what was happening and had been planning for this moment for decades. The revelation of Carter's true nature was stunning in its implications. The helpful fisherman who had tried to warn William away from the island was actually one of the key players in the Hartwell family's disappearance, someone who had been living with the knowledge of their fate and working to keep it hidden ever since. Harrison's reaction to Carter's arrival was not surprise, but recognition, and the conversation that followed revealed the complex web of relationships and motivations that had led to this moment. Carter had not been merely an employee of the Hartwell family, but a trusted confidant who had been drawn into their world of secrets and ultimately into the violence that had destroyed them. The rising water in the cave added a sense of deadly urgency to the confrontations, as all parties realized that they might not survive long enough to resolve their differences unless they could find a way to escape from the flooding chambers before the entire cave system became a death trap. The truth that emerged in those flooded caves was more complex and tragic than William could have imagined, revealing that the simple story of a missing family was actually a tale of betrayal, desperation, and violence that had been carefully covered up for 3 decades. Harrison's emotional breakdown as he faced the evidence of his family's fate revealed him to be not the villain William had assumed, but David Hartwell, the elder son who had survived the tragedy that claimed the rest of his family and had spent 30 years seeking justice for their deaths. His desperate search of the island and his violent methods were driven not by greed, but by a need to find proof of what had really happened and to ensure that those responsible finally faced consequences for their actions. The real villain was Carter, who had been far more than just a boat captain for the Hartwell family. He had been Robert Hartwell's business partner in illegal activities that had made the family wealthy, but had also made them targets for elimination. When the Hartwells had discovered that Carter was betraying them to their enemies and planning to steal their hidden wealth, the confrontation had turned violent, resulting in the deaths of Robert, Eleanor, and Michael Hartwell in the very caves where they now sheltered from the storm. Carter had spent the intervening years maintaining his cover as a simple fisherman while secretly controlling access to the island and eliminating anyone who came too close to discovering his crimes. Oliver's presence in the cave as both witness and victim added another layer of tragedy to the situation, as the boy was forced to confront the truth about his father's double life and the violence that had shaped his entire childhood. Falcon's reaction to the revelation was immediate and fierce, as the hybrid animal's loyalty to the Hartwell family reasserted itself in the face of their killer, transforming him from William's gentle companion into an instrument of long-delayed vengeance. The confrontation that followed was brutal and decisive, with Carter's decades of careful planning and manipulation finally unraveling in the face of the truth he had tried so hard to bury. The final twist that shattered everything William thought he knew about his situation came when Harrison, in his desperation to convince William of his innocence, revealed the stunning truth about William's own identity and connection to Blackwater Island. The documents that Harrison had been so desperate to recover weren't just evidence of Carter's crimes. They were proof that William was not a random buyer who had stumbled onto the island by chance, but Michael Hartwell himself, the younger son who had left home to join the military and had never returned. The amnesia and identity confusion that William had attributed to combat stress and grief over his wife's death were actually the result of trauma from witnessing his family's murder 30 years ago, trauma so severe that his mind had constructed an entirely new identity to protect him from memories too painful to bear. Martha, the wife whose death had supposedly driven William to seek solitude on the island, had been a therapist who had helped him construct his new life and identity, her death triggering the return of suppressed memories that had led him back to the place where his nightmare had begun. Falcon's extraordinary connection to William and his knowledge of the island's secrets suddenly made sense. The hybrid animal had been Michael's companion and protector 30 years ago, had witnessed the family's murder, and had been waiting ever since for his master's return. The dog's apparent aging and remarkable longevity were explained by his hybrid genetics and his deep psychological bond with Michael, a bond that had sustained him through 3 decades of solitary guardianship on the island where his family had died. Harrison's desperate search for evidence hadn't been driven by a need for justice alone, but by his need to help his younger brother remember who he was and reclaim his rightful inheritance from the man who had stolen it through murder and deception. The island that William thought he had bought for $900 was actually his own family property, returning to him through a legal mechanism that his older brother had spent years arranging in preparation for this moment of revelation and recovery. As the caves continued to flood and the storm raged overhead, the confrontation between Carter and the 2 Hartwell brothers reached its climax in a battle that had been 3 decades in the making. Carter's desperation made him dangerous, but he was facing opponents who had advantages he couldn't have anticipated. David's years of planning and preparation, Michael's recovered military training and survival skills, and Falcon's fierce loyalty and hybrid capabilities that made him more than a match for any human opponent. The flooded caves became a battleground where past and present collided in a struggle that would determine not only who would survive the night, but also whether justice would finally be served for crimes that had been hidden for an entire generation. Carter's final gambit involved threatening Oliver's life to force the brothers to surrender, but he had underestimated the bond between Falcon and the boy, as well as the hybrid animal's ability to act independently to protect those under his care. The resolution was swift and decisive, with Falcon's intervention creating the opportunity for the Hartwell brothers to overpower their family's killer and ensure that he would finally face justice for his crimes. As the storm began to subside and rescue teams arrived on the island, the long nightmare of the Hartwell family tragedy finally came to an end, with the truth revealed, the guilty punished, and the survivors free to begin the process of healing and recovery that had been delayed for far too long. The aftermath of that terrible night brought both justice and healing to all those whose lives had been shattered by Carter's decades-long deception. Carter was arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder, kidnapping, and fraud, finally facing the consequences for crimes he had thought were safely buried in the past. The evidence recovered from the caves, combined with Harrison's testimony and the financial records William had discovered, provided prosecutors with an overwhelming case that ensured Carter would spend the rest of his life in prison. Oliver faced the devastating reality of learning that his father was a murderer, but he was not left to cope with this trauma alone. Yara, whose own family had been affected by the Hartwell disappearance, took immediate steps to ensure Oliver received the counseling and support he needed to process the terrible truth about his father's crimes. The local community, which had lived under the shadow of the Hartwell mystery for 30 years, finally had answers to questions that had haunted them for an entire generation. William, now fully remembering his identity as Michael Hartwell, made the decision to transform Blackwater Island into a memorial for his murdered family, while also creating a safe haven for other trauma survivors who needed a place to heal. David, who had spent 30 years consumed by his need for justice, was finally able to begin grieving properly for the family he had lost and building a relationship with the brother he thought he would never see again. The island's tragic history was acknowledged and honored, but its future would be dedicated to healing rather than harboring secrets. Financial settlements were made to compensate those who had been harmed by Carter's crimes, including Oliver, who would inherit enough money to ensure his education and future were secure despite the loss of his father. The legal process also revealed the extent of Carter's criminal network, leading to additional arrests and the recovery of stolen assets that had been hidden for decades throughout the region. Michael's journey back to his true identity was neither quick nor easy, requiring months of therapy and patience as suppressed memories gradually returned and the artificial persona of William Williams slowly faded away. The process was complicated by the fact that Michael had genuinely loved Martha, even though she had been part of his constructed identity rather than his original life. And grieving for her, while simultaneously recovering memories of his murdered family, created a complex emotional landscape that required professional help to navigate. David proved to be an invaluable source of support during this difficult transition, sharing memories of their childhood and helping Michael piece together the fragments of his past that had been lost to trauma and time. The brothers discovered that despite the decades of separation and the terrible circumstances that had kept them apart, their fundamental bond remained strong, and they were able to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of shared experience and mutual understanding. Michael's military service, which had originally been a source of conflict with their father, became a source of strength during his recovery, as the discipline and resilience he had developed as a soldier helped him cope with the overwhelming task of integrating two separate identities into a coherent sense of self. The island itself played a crucial role in his healing process, as returning to the places where his family had lived and died allowed him to process his grief in a healthy way, rather than continuing to suppress it. David's years of research and investigation had preserved not only evidence of Carter's crimes, but also countless memories and mementos of their family's life together, gifts that helped Michael reconnect with the person he had been before trauma had forced him to become someone else. The brothers made the decision to honor their parents' memory by continuing some of the charitable work that Eleanor Hartwell had been passionate about, establishing foundations that would help other families affected by violence and trauma. Falcon's role in the family's reunion and recovery was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire story. As the hybrid animal had maintained his loyalty and vigilance for 30 years, while waiting for the moment when he could fulfill his original purpose as protector and guardian of the Hartwell family. The revelation of Falcon's true nature and his extraordinary longevity became a source of wonder rather than fear, as Michael began to remember the special bond he had shared with the animal during his childhood and adolescence on the island. Falcon's hybrid genetics had given him not only exceptional physical capabilities, but also an intelligence and emotional depth that allowed him to understand and respond to human needs in ways that ordinary animals could not. His patient guardianship of the island's secrets and his gentle guidance of Michael back to his true identity demonstrated a level of devotion and understanding that transcended normal animal behavior. The relationship between Michael and Falcon deepened as Michael's memories returned, with both of them rediscovering the partnership that had been interrupted by tragedy 3 decades ago. Falcon's presence became a living link to Michael's past, helping him remember not only the trauma he had endured, but also the happiness and love that had characterized his early life with his family. The hybrid animal's remarkable story attracted the attention of researchers and animal behaviorists, but Michael carefully protected Falcon's privacy while allowing limited scientific study that might help other animals and their human companions. David, who had never fully understood the bond between his younger brother and the unusual animal, came to appreciate Falcon's importance in Michael's life and recovery process. Together, the 3 of them formed a unique family unit that honored the past while building toward a future that none of them could have imagined during the dark years of separation and searching. Falcon's advanced age, despite his hybrid vigor, meant that his remaining years with the reunited brothers were precious and limited, making their time together all the more meaningful as they worked to create new memories while honoring the old ones that had sustained them through decades of separation. The transformation of Blackwater Island from a place of secrets and tragedy into a beacon of hope and healing became Michael's most important mission as he worked to honor his family's memory while building something positive from the ashes of their destruction. The island's isolation and natural beauty, which had once made it an ideal hiding place for dark secrets, now made it perfect for a retreat center where trauma survivors could find peace and support in a setting that understood the power of both nature and human resilience to overcome even the most devastating experiences. Michael used his recovered inheritance, combined with David's resources and support from the local community, to create facilities that could accommodate individuals and families who needed time and space to heal from their own traumatic experiences. The center's programs were designed around the understanding that healing from trauma is not a linear process, and that different people need different approaches and timelines to recover their sense of safety and identity. Yara became involved in the project as both an advisor and eventual director, bringing her knowledge of the local ecosystem and her understanding of the island's history to create programs that combined outdoor therapy with traditional counseling approaches. Oliver, despite his young age, became an important part of the healing community, as his own recovery from the trauma of learning about his father's crimes provided inspiration and hope for other young people dealing with family-related trauma. The island's cave system, once a hiding place for terrible secrets, was transformed into a memorial space where visitors could reflect on the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of truth and justice in the healing process. Michael and David worked together to create educational programs that would help prevent future tragedies by teaching people to recognize the warning signs of domestic violence and criminal behavior, ensuring that their family's story would serve as both a cautionary tale and a source of hope for others facing similar challenges. As Michael stood on the dock where he had first arrived as William Williams, watching the sunset paint Blackwater Island in shades of gold and crimson, he reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him home to himself and to the family he thought he had lost forever. The island that had once represented isolation and fear now symbolized healing and hope. Not just for him, but for all the people whose lives had been touched by the tragedy and recovery of the Hartwell family story. Falcon sat beside him, older now but still alert and protective, his presence a constant reminder of the loyalty and love that had sustained them all through the darkest chapters of their shared history. David joined them on the dock, and for a moment the 3 companions stood in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the past they had survived and the future they were building together. The words that Michael had learned to live by during his recovery echoed in his mind. Loyalty and courage have the power to transcend time, restore justice, and heal even the deepest wounds that life can inflict upon the human heart. The message had become clear through their extraordinary journey. True loyalty never dies, and courage can overcome any obstacle when guided by love and sustained by hope. Michael turned to the camera that David was using to document their story, knowing that their experience could inspire others who might be struggling with their own buried traumas or family mysteries. If you have a story about the most loyal friend in your life, please share it in the comments below, he said, his voice carrying the warmth and strength that had been forged through years of struggle and ultimate triumph. David added his own invitation. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss other stories about the incredible connections between people and the animals who share our lives and our hearts. These stories remind us that love and loyalty can survive anything, even decades of separation and loss. As the video concluded, Michael pointed toward the screen where the next story was already appearing. Click on that next video to discover another amazing journey of courage, loyalty, and the unbreakable bonds that define the very best of human and animal relationships. The camera captured one final image of the three companions standing together on the dock, with Falcon's noble profile silhouetted against the setting sun, and the peaceful waters of Lake Michigan stretching toward the horizon. Michael's final words carried across the water with the weight of hard-won wisdom. To all the veterans and their families who have sacrificed so much to protect our freedom and our way of life, we send our deepest gratitude and respect. Your courage and dedication make stories like ours possible, and we will never forget the debt we owe to those who serve and those who wait for them to come home.